Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Stratagoy video. Ryan here with a continuation of our Idoneth Deepkin War Scrolls coverage. Obviously we had our index review, Jonas and I, and then we had, I started the series off talking about the three big monsters, so the Leviathan and the two Eidolons. But now in part two, we're moving on to the Cavalry. So that's going to be our two kings, the Eels and the Shark. So anyway, thank you so much for all the positive comments on the other two videos, and keep the buzz going for us if you're enjoying the content. But let's get on with the show. Okay, so as I just mentioned, we started with monsters, and then we're moving on to cavalry today. But the last video will be the rest of the units, which will be the infantry. So basically the two Namarti units and the Ishlaen heroes, plus the Akhelian Thrallmaster, and maybe a surprise guest at the end, which occurred to me last night. But anyway, so talking about cavalry, let's get started. So as a reminder, Jonas and Siegfried came up with, or at least used this system for rating everything. Again, it's early days, so, you know, keep in mind that I might change my own opinions by the time I've played a few more games. But for the time being, 8 games in, this is where I'm kind of sitting. A 1 star is best to avoid, 2 stars is a suboptimal pick, 3 stars is decent in certain situations, 4 is great in most situations, and 5 wouldn't hurt to bring it in every list. All right, so let's get started with Volturnos himself, the king of the Idoneth, and our only war master. So he's 270 points. In his regiment, he can take 0 to 1 Loton or Thrallmaster. So the Ishlaen heroes all had Loton as a 0 to 1, but not the Thrallmaster. And the only two units that can take him as part of their regiment are the two kings, if I'm not mistaken. And then he is not only a literal war master, but also what I call a war master type, in the sense that he can take any Idoneth Deepkin you like, mix and match in his regiment. And of course, he has to be the general, so his regiment will always have 4 slots available to you. Okay, so looking at his profile, he moves 12 inches, which is kind of a middle movement. We've got the Leviathan moving at 10, and the Eidolons as well. We've got the Eels moving at 14, and then Volturnos, the king, and the Shark are moving at 12. He's got 8 health, which is a little more than the regular king, 3 up save, control 2. No ward officially, but he does have, if you look at his green passive ability there, he's got a 3-up ward against the mortal damage inflicted by spell abilities, prayer abilities, or abilities used by manifestations. Now, what does that mean? Well, obviously, spells and prayers don't have attack profiles. So everything that they're doing in terms of damage is mortal damage. So that's obvious. And a 3-up ward is obviously good. But manifestations have 2 ways of attacking you. They do have some that have mortal damage, and that's great that he can kind of shrug that off. But a lot of the manifestations, especially in Morbid Conjuration, are flying around doing actual combat damage, which would not count as mortal unless it's a crit mortal. So some of them might have crit mortals on them, and those would also be warded off by these. But for the rest, it would just be regular damage that you get a chance to save against, and that would not qualify. Anyway, so if we jump back up to his melee profile, he's got 6 attacks, 2s, 3s, -2, damage 2, but it goes to damage 3 on the charge. His named companion doesn't actually have a different profile than the unnamed version's companion, but that's 4 attacks, 4s, 3s, -1, 2. If you compare that to an eel, it's 1 extra attack, and then the damage is fixed at 2, so it's less swingy than a D3. Okay, so his passive ability, the red one, first among Akhelians, is adding +1 to hit rolls for combat attacks made by other friendly Akhelian units while they're holy than 12. So let's talk about a couple details there. First off, what are the other Akhelian units? Well, Akhelian Kings, so he's the only one that doesn't benefit from it. We've also got the Akhelian Thrallmaster as our other hero, though I don't expect you're going to be seeing a whole lot of him standing next to an Akhelian Thrallmaster, but could be if you're going for a Thralls build with him, although the Thralls don't benefit from this particular rule. Then we're talking about the Sharks and the Eels and the Turtle, but as I've mentioned in plenty of other videos, this is only impacting the attacks by the riders, which means the companions, which are the eels and turtle and shark themselves, aren't getting the benefit of this, despite the fact that they really are the ones you'd like to see get the benefit of, especially for the bigger monster types like the Leviathan and the shark. But obviously this is good for specific units, and if you want to get +1 to hit on those companions, you can always take Akhelian Beastmasters, the battle formation, which does in fact let them have +1 to hit on the mountain attacks specifically. So all-out attack, and I'll be referencing this often during this video, all-out attack is one of the few abilities that does say that companions get it. So if you use your one all-out attack in the combat phase that you can per turn on a specific unit, they would be getting +1 to hit on both the rider and the companion, the mount. But there's another way to get that without having to blow CP, and that would be to have, at least for Akhelian units, Volturnos standing around in nearby those units for the rider to get +1, and then you could be in Akhelian Beastmasters for a +1 as well. So there's another way to get that, and that's basically a free all-out attack as long as you're okay with standing next to Volturnos, of course. And then he's got a once per battle any combat phase ability where he picks up to 3 other, not himself, friendly Idoneth Deepkin units, so not specifically Akhelian, it's all of them, holier than 12 to be the targets, and you add 1 to the attacks characteristic of the target's melee weapons for the rest of the turn. Now, being once per battle, that's obviously something you want to get timed right, probably in High Tide, or maybe even in Flood Tide, so that you clear those units out so that the following turn you can fight first. But anyway, so again, this is not impacting the mounts, but because it's applying to more than just Akhelians, you've got some other targets that are kind of interesting. I'll talk about some of those later. But anyway, let's move on to my summary in the notes. So he's a great synergy piece, especially for Akhelians, for obvious reasons. He has solid melee output himself, which we'll be talking about momentarily. His once per battle +1 attack is best on eels and thralls. The reason being, and I mentioned this in the last video on monsters, that if you're going to give out these buffs, they are typically best on the units who have a higher percentage of their output that aren't companions than, say, others. For example, the Leviathan is perhaps the worst case scenario because the riders contribute very little to the output compared to the turtle. And so you're paying 500 points to get this buff for +1 attack that's only impacting the riders. And then the turtle, isn't seeing it at all. The shark is also kind of a similar story. But the eels do have a good amount of attacks, but the riders also have a good amount of impact, especially for Morrsarr Guard on the charge. And so adding +1 attack has a bigger proportional value boost to those units than it would if you were looking at something where the riders just don't contribute that much. Now, +1 attack also, if you're looking for maximizing your output, is best on units who have a high damage profile or otherwise a really good profile, but a low number of attacks. So imagine you only had 1 attack. Adding +1 attack is doubling your output. Now, the lowest you have for any of your units that really matter would be 1, but that would be on the reverse. So if technically one of your only units that's within holier than 12 inches at the moment that you're needing to use this ability happens to be a big block of reavers, you are doubling their output. And I can tell you right now, they have 1/3 wound before saves per model. So you're doubling that output to 2/3, which is pretty good, depending on what kind of save they've got. But it is weighted dice, I guess. But otherwise, the rest of your units that you really care about are going to be like your Thralls, which have 2 attacks already, and your Morrsarr Guard as well for the Riders have 2 attacks, which means adding 1 attack is adding 50% value to your output. And then Ishlaen Guard have 3 attacks, which means you're only adding 33%. But it's still good. It's still solid. And you just have to get the timing down for that ability. Okay, because he's a War Master, he must be your general, so you better protect him. I think a Leviathan is a decent way to do this. And kind of combining this with my next point is that the only downside to in contrast to the King is that Volturnos can't take enhancements. So that means you can't take Armor of the Sith Eye or Ancient Pride to protect him better. Your best bet is to keep him around a turtle or around the boat or both. Remember, the boat gives you +1 save and the turtle's giving you a 5 up ward. And then, of course, you could screen him. He would count for guarded heroes so long as he's near the right kind of unit, at least for the -1 to hit, because he's not infantry. And then, obviously, you're getting -1 to hit in the first turn. There's all kinds of little things you can do. You can always teleport him to get him to a safe place with one of your wizards. Or you could, what am I trying to say? In Soul Raid Ambushers, you could put him in the sky if you want. And have him reset up somewhere so he can project that 12-inch bubble somewhere else if you need him to. One of the main reasons I'm really emphasizing this is that in the current GHB, your general's regiment, everything in it gives your opponent a target for a battle tactic, which means you've basically got to be careful about how many things you put in his regiment, preferably big units that have a lot of wounds that need to be eaten through, or tanky units, or both. And Volturnos isn't super tanky, but Idoneth has never been super tanky in general. They're an elf army. So just protect him so that you're not giving them a free battle tactic. Okay, so let's take a look at his output. And by the way, I did rank him a 4-star, but we'll talk about that in a second. So this is, as we covered in the index review, this is him with only his War Scroll abilities, like things that impact him without relying on external buffs. So his base output, you can see here, is, again, if you haven't seen one of my charts before, this is against 6-up, 5-up, 4-up, 3-up, 2-up save, and then expected value average is a flat uniform average of those 5, because all-out defense is a little less common than it once was, and save stacking is definitely less common, meaning a 4-up is pretty average. And then if we average them out, depending on how much rend you're doing, it'll come out to roughly the same thing, the expected value average, as a 4-up, but sometimes it's a little different. Like I think here it's a little higher. Anyway, so if you look at the expected value average in the rightmost column there, he's doing somewhere around 7 wounds on average against all saves. And if he's on the charge, that jumps up to almost 10, which is not bad at all. So in the chart below, I had this kind of chart for the first time in the last video, where the first line will show us the unit at hand that we're talking about. And what we did is we looked at his efficiency per 100 points worth of Volturnos. So how do you compute that? You divide his expected value average on a given profile. I went with his charge profile because you don't want him to be in combat too often without charging. You want him to have as much going for him as possible. Otherwise, why are you throwing your general just into combat just to get a couple pot shots off? So anyway, we computed that with expected value average, so the orange bar there. And you divide it by his total number of points, and then you multiply it by 100 so that it's scaled per 100 points. Because I think we can all think relatively easily in 100-point increments. We have example units that are roughly 100 or 200 points, and you can kind of do the math there. And it's just a scale. We could have compared it on any level, but I think this makes sense at 100. So he's doing roughly per 100 points, 3 2/3 wounds on average. And then under change, because we're not comparing him to himself, it doesn't have any change, right? Now, then I compared him to some of the other units in this conversation here today. So the Allopex is doing around 50% worse, or you can see it the other way around. It's Volturnos is at 48% better than the Allopex per 100 points. Now, that's not taking into account the Allopex's shooting attacks. That is taking into account, however, the +1 attack he gets when he is, there's blood in the water, essentially, for the mount attack. But as you can see, and we'll talk about later, the Allopex is going to be one of our worst performers per 100 points, one of our least efficient units, especially if you're just looking at either the shooting or looking at the combat. Obviously, it gets better when you combine them, but we'll talk about it later. The Ishlaen Guard are almost identical. This is assuming they're going into infantry, which gives them an extra point of rend. They're almost identical to Volturnos. So Volturnos is 2% worse, and that's why in the change column we're seeing a negative there. It might seem like I'm talking about the Ishlaen is 2% worse. We're comparing everything to Volturnos, so the change column is what Volturnos is relative to those, if that was confusing. And then the Morrsarr Guard is our best output for a cavalry unit at 5 1/3 roughly, and Volturnos is about 48% worse from them. So in theory, Volturnos is about as good, as much better against the Allopex as he is worse against the Morrsarr Guard. So he's about halfway in between. Now, of course, we can only take one Volturnos. He's unique. So when we talk about per 100 points, the assumption is, well, I could replace Volturnos for, say we were comparing him to a king, and Volturnos was much more efficient than a king. You would say, well, I'm just going to take multiple Volturnoses, but you just can't, obviously. So it's still an interesting metric, but as I mentioned last time, we're not taking into account how tanky a unit is to see how long it stays fighting on the battlefield, because that calculation's a good bit more complicated. Okay, so let's move on to one other thing about Volturnos, which is, let's see what happens when he gets to really shine with, he's on the charge, and then he's also getting either Beastmasters for his mount, he's getting the Eidolon of the Storm for the +1 to wound, again, only on the rider, or he's getting both, and he's on the charge. So you can kind of look at the expected value average here. That's going to be a little more than 10 for all three at least, but for just the Beastmasters. Then it goes up to almost 12 for having the Eidolon of the Storms profile. And if you can get both, we're going above 12, which I did not in the table below compute for all this, because I didn't think it was all that relevant to be looking at what he's like against all those buffs. Partly because technically, if you're going to do that computation, you say the Storm is in the equation, the Eidolon of the Storm, then you need to combine their points together and then assume they're walking together rounds to give each other the buffs or whatever. And then what you're doing, well, actually, Volturnos can't give him his buff, but they're walking around together, and then you compute all of their output together and then divide by their total points and compute like that. That's the correct way to do that. That's why I tried not to do that for anything that requires an external source, because then the math and calculation gets more complicated. Obviously, that said, Beastmasters is free, but it does mean you're giving up one of your other formation options. So anyway, I would say Volturnos has some great output, and I'm pretty up on him because I feel like he's a fast, beat sticky hero, especially for his points. He's has a lot of synergy with other units. He can bring the widest variety of units that the army is capable of for heroes. And I don't know, it's just thematic. It's a cool model. You just got to protect him. That's his biggest downside. Okay, let's move on to his generic cousin, the Akhelian King. Obviously, Volturnos was once an Akhelian King and then aspired to being the High King, I guess, of all of the Idoneth. Now, the Akhelian King is cheaper. He's 70 points cheaper at the moment. He has the same regiment options, 0 to 1, low 10, or Thrallmaster, not either or both, I should say, 0 to 1 of each, and any to Idoneth. And then if we look at his War Scroll, he's got the same move, same control, same save, but one less health characteristic. He doesn't have the ward against mortal damage from spells, prayers, and manifestations. His first melee profile has one less attack, and instead of being on, 2s and 3s, it's on 3s and 4s, so it's -1 to both. His rend is only at 1, which can only get improved if he makes a charge and then rolls a d3 2 up, but we'll talk about that in a second. His damage is identical, though, 2 to Volturnos, 2 and then 3 if on the charge. His mount, however, is identical as well. So let's talk about his charge phase ability. Unlike Volturnos, so both of these abilities are unique to him. So if you charged, you pick an enemy unit within 1 inch and roll a d3. On a d3 2+, so on a 3+ on a d6. You inflict amount of mortal damage on the target equal to the roll, so that's either a d3 2 or a d3 3, so on average 2.5 if it goes through, but on actual average, considering it could fail, the expected value is 1 2/3 mortal damage. And then, in addition, you get to add +1 to the ring characteristic of the Akhelian royal weapons, so the rider's weapons, which puts him up to being the same as Volturnos, just with worse attack, hit, and wound. So you can already imagine that he's not doing as much output, but keep in mind he is 70 points cheaper. His other ability is one of these heroes that brings in another unit to fight along with them. And so basically you can pick a non-hero Akhelian Cavalry, so not another king and not another, or not Volturnos. And then, so after this guy fights, and he doesn't have to have charged to have done this, which is nice. They just have to be standing within his combat range, and then they can fight immediately after him. So we'll talk about that ability in a second. So let's scroll or move over to the notes. So I said he lacks a strong reason for being, as in he kind of has an identity problem in the sense that He's easier to kill. He's not as punchy as Volturnos. I don't know how many kings you're really trying to take in a list. He's not buffing any of your guys except that they can fight right after him. Even his extra rend only goes off on a functionally a 3+ on a d6. And he does have, of course, the mortal damage. And as I said in the next point, he has to charge to have solid output, which is true for a lot of Idoneth units, to be fair, but still. His best advantage, is that he can take enhancements, unlike Volturnos. So you could put Ancient Pride on him to protect him, or Armor the Sithai, or any of the other cool enhancements that we have access to kind of protect him or buff him. You could give him +1 rend against heroes if you really want to make sure he's got 2 rend against at least heroes all the time. There are things you could do. I would probably go for protective stuff, but I could see wanting to run some of the other abilities. Especially considering he wants to be around the cavalry all the time, he might want to take the morsels to be healing them every movement phase. Anyway, my next point was he likes to work with Eels for a 1-2 punch, the reaction ability in red there. The reason I'm saying Eels here is that a shark unit, although it does have good output, it's not as much, it costs more than a unit of either type of Eels and doesn't have as much output. And because obviously this isn't taking into account its shooting ability, it's only taking into account its combat ability. So you're losing part of the reason that what makes sharks good anyway. In addition, you can't reinforce a shark unit. So if you could even just double its size, I would maybe consider it. But the fact that you're only getting to bring 1 model in is just kind of underwhelming when you could be bringing in 6 Eels, 6 Morrsarr or 6 Ishlaen. And considering you don't have to have charge to get this ability off, that's kind of nice. You're getting the guaranteed king plus those guys. And the thing to think about, a lot of times we think of these abilities not so great, but there's always a conversation to be had about going back and forth with choosing your activations in a given combat phase and your opponents. Granted, in High Tide, when you've got Strike First for your whole army, this is less of an important issue. But this going back and forth can cost you some of your particularly glass cannon-y units. And if you need to push the output of a given unit over the edge to make sure that they're not going to hit back hard enough, or that you're free for a counter charge and or charge the following turn, then having the king go first and then a big block of Morrsarr on the charge is probably enough to clear that unit out. Whereas if you had to do the king and then a Morrsarr unit, or 2 Morrsarr, let's say 2 different separate units of Morrsarr and 6s, there's always the chance that they're going to clap back at the second one that hasn't fought yet and then diminish it, and then you're, hurting. So I do think there's some timing here that could be really handy, especially if you make a list that's got a king per 2, like 1 king each for 2 different blocks of 6 Morrsarr Guard you've got, and you send them kind of in like attack formations to go around, especially if they're both benefiting from, say, a Volturnos in the neighborhood or a Eidolon of the Storm. Maybe one has Volturnos and one has Eidolon of the Storm to make sure they're both performing at pretty good buffs. Anyway, and I also said that there's maybe a meme list out there for lots of kings. Like, you could take 5 of these for sure, and or maybe like, I don't know if it would be good, but you could, because they can take anything you want in the list, you could just do like 4 kings, Volturnos, and like some Morrsarr Guard or something like that, a bunch of Morrsarr, or an Eidolon of Storm. You could just go hero hammer it up, maybe 3 kings, Volturnos, and Eidolon of Storm, and just go, and then the rest is just Eels, and just go going around and striking as a big old group and knocking stuff out and sending individual units over to the side if you absolutely had to go grab objectives or whatever. It's probably just a meme, but I do think there's some version of reality where that could be interesting, at least with maybe 2 kings. Let's take a look at his output. So this is similar to Volturnos. We're going to look at War Scroll only and then move on to all the buffs. So his base, you can see here on expected value, is only 4 wounds on average if he didn't get a charge off. If he does charge, it goes up to about 7. So it's going up by quite a lot, a 75% performance increase, which is pretty nice. Now, if we look at his damage per 100 points, he's actually within a tiny margin of Volturnos, assuming that they both got charges off. The reason is, even though Volturnos clearly does more damage, is because the 70 points difference, and of course the fact that you could take more kings, but means that they actually have very similar outputs, but Volturnos is less reliant on having charge than the king is, so keep that in mind. Again, compared to an Allopex, like Volturnos, he's about 48% better, and on the contrast to that, we got the Morrsarr Guard, where he's about 48% worse, and then Ishlaen, he's about 2% worse. So again, that's Ishlaen against infantry, and that's Morrsarr on the charge. The Allopex is also assuming that it's bloodthirsty or whatever. So if we go down, if we switch to the next chart, which is when he's getting external buffs, so that's going to be, again, the Storm is actually the weakest of the three, but not by that much. +1 to hit would be either combining Volturnos, his +1 to hit for the Rider, and Akhelian Beastmasters, or just doing an all-out attack. That puts him at the orange bar there, which is, both of these are slightly above 8. And then both puts you above 10, which is actually pretty good output, all things considered, especially if he gets to fight in conjunction with some Eels. Hence me saying that maybe you've got the Storm, you got Volturnos, and all that stuff. That said, if you didn't have any wizards in your list, I think you're going to be missing some crucial parts of what makes Idoneth strong right now. But anyway, that's the Akhelian King. I gave him 2 stars because I don't know if he really has a great place. I could see maybe, again, that Morrsarr build, but I just think you're better off with Volturnos 9 times out of 10, unless you're just cramped for points. And then you've got, what's it called? So many other things you're trying to fit into your list, and the points are a little bit rough. But there's a version of reality where a king makes sense. Just maybe make one of your Eidolons if you take the Eidolon, your general, if you're not taking Volturnos, because the king is even easier to snipe out than Volturnos, and obviously doesn't have to be your general. Okay. All right, so moving on to the Allopex. I'm basically going from most expensive to least for the 5 cavalry options. So because we're done with heroes now, we're going to talk about what units can take them, and I think it's the same for all 3 of these coming units here. That's by both kings can take an Allopex, both Eidolons and Loton, all of which have basically any Idoneth Deepkin as their regiment options. So an Allopex is 8 health, 12-inch move like the last 2 units, 4 up save, so a little bit worse, control 2, and it has a choice of 2 ranged weapons, which are identical, except one is anti-monster +1 Ren, and one is anti-cavalry. If I were you, I would just say all of them are nets for the time being, because I think we're going to be going into a heavier cavalry meta at the moment than a monster meta. But, you know, obviously we're talking about cavalry right now, and I'm going to tell you I think cavalry is a strong build for Idoneth, so I think that holds for a bunch of other armies too. You know, the Varan Guards, Chaos Knights, different Stormcast Cav maybe, what do they call, Dawn Riders, Black Knights. I think there's all kinds of lists that are going to be running cavalry, so keep that in mind. The shooting profile is not bad. It's 18 inches, which is tied for the furthest that we've got with the Leviathan. 2 attacks only, 3 to hit, 2 to wound, 1 rend, and 3 damage. So it's swingy, because if it goes through, it does quite a bit. But it's really a shame with a 3 up to hit here that you can't take sharks in groups of 2. I get why they did that you can't reinforce single models like, let's say, Warp Lightning Cannons and put 2 in a unit. But the sharks, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me that they have to be lone agents. But in any case, what I'm getting at here is that an all-out attack is not really going to be worth it when you probably have some other unit you'd rather save that CP for, considering all it's doing is boosting the likelihood that these 2 attacks go through. So, you know, it is what it is. But I'm not going to look a decent shooting profile in the mouth, a gift horse in the mouth, as we say sometimes in English. That said, it doesn't have shooting combat, and this thing clearly has an identity thing where it wants to get into combat eventually because it's decent. Now, the shooting phase ability that's on the right side of the War Scroll is probably the main reason people would want to still consider taking an Allopex, which is that after having shot at either an enemy monster or cavalry unit and having done some damage points to it by the shooting attacks, you roll a die on a 3 up, so 2/3 of the time, until the start of your next turn. Subtract 1 from the number of dice rolled when making charge rolls for the target to a minimum of 1. So taking them down usually from a 2d6 charge to a 1d6 charge. This is a fantastic ability, unquestionably. If he had even longer range, I'd be even a bigger fan. And honestly, I don't know why it couldn't have been 24 because, you know, it's not that broken to do that because the ability only goes off on a 3-up. If it went off automatically, I would say 18 inches is definitely totally fine and maybe even a little broken. And then he'd be maybe an auto take. But going off, you know, on a 3-up is pretty rough. So basically, how this would work is you could have 2 Allopexes for redundancy and they could both shoot at the same unit and try to whittle it down. And that also, of course, increases the chance that they actually get some damage through. And then it's an eligible ability. And then even though... Well, so what you could do, let's rewind a bit. This isn't like at the end of the shooting phase. So you could just shoot with one, see if they do damage, and then try to roll. If it goes through, then you can shoot at a different target, or if you just want to do the damage, you could keep shooting at it with this one, but it's not going to, you know, subtract another die. But the idea here is that you're really trying to slow down that cavalry or monster from getting into combat with your dudes. And Idoneth does like to play caddy, you know, and stay away from things. But at the same time, there's a real good chance they'll ward it off, especially if you shot at the type that you don't have, or I said ward it off, but I mean like save it off. That there's, especially if you shot at the type that you didn't choose in your list building. So if you chose anti-monster and you shoot at Cav, even though this ability still works on that unit, you only have -1 rend, so it's less likely it's going to take any damage. I don't know. The 3-up is what really gets me on this one. And obviously, if they're already pretty close, subtracting 1 from their charge rolls isn't going to make a big impact anyway. And keep in mind, let's say you're at 18 inches, exactly like 17.99 inches away, something like that, whatever, 18 inches exactly from a Dawn Riders unit. And you get this off. Then they just move 14 the next turn, or maybe with Speed of Hish, move further. And then they're within 3 inches of you anyway. Now, that means your Allopex has to be a bit of a vanguard ahead of the rest of the stuff you don't want to get charged in, because it had to be there within 18 inches to have gotten the shots off. And then, you know, it's got to be stopping it from coming in and getting to your units. But if your units are equidistant away from the Allopexes, because you're in some kind of, like I've said many times in the other video, the index, shoal mentality, where you're flying around with all of your buff pieces in a kind of a school, then, you know, your other stuff's probably going to be easily enough reached by that cavalry unit. Anyway, that's the main reason I think people are going to be taking this unit. And then if we just look at the Bloodthirsty Predators, I've already referenced it. The Allopex's companion weapon gets +1 attack if you're, while there's a damaged enemy unit anywhere within 6 inches of it, or an enemy unit that had models slain in this turn, which is pretty easy to get. So in all of my computations, I've kind of assumed that. Now the Riders, again, like I've said before, are not doing a whole lot of damage. It's 4 attacks, elf profile, 3s, 4s, -1/1. And then the Allopex itself is 3 attacks, 4 if they're bloodthirsty, 4s, 2s, typical monster kind of profile, 2 rend, but could be 3 against monsters, and doing 2 damage. So it's a decent profile, but we'll break it down in a second. So if we look at my notes, it's an anti-monster or cavalry tech, based off of not only what you choose for the ranged weapon, but also that it gets +1 rend against monsters in combat. And its shooting attack has to be, like its shooting ability has to be against monsters and cavalry to make them lose a die of charge. Otherwise, its output is kind of inefficient, as I've kind of alluded to with the other comparisons for the War Scrolls we've seen thus far. For its points cost of 190 for one model, it's just not pulling a whole lot of weight. It doesn't receive buffs well because its best output is either the companion in combat, which can only really receive all at attack, or which of course you're wasting on a 1 shark, which is what I would say about the shooting profile. It's 1 shark is getting it, because we don't have any ways to buff your shooting profile in Idoneth really, other than all at attack. And then the other thing it's inefficient about is the fact that your best buffs from the storm and Volturnos are not impacting the shark itself. It's impacting the kind of weak riders, which is not really all that exciting. It's basically 2 thralls who don't get any of the extra thrall bonuses for extra rend against infantry or +1 damage against monsters. So I don't know if it's worth buffing 2 thralls for 190 points, you know. Shark spam, which was a big build as of late with the Feuilleton, the way it used to work, or eventually became to work, and then they nerfed it a bit, but still was decently strong. They had a much longer shooting range. The shooting output was less swingy. It was just a good build, and they were still really good in melee, and we're receiving some of the buffs that you could give out, like, you know, it was just a little bit better to get stuff off. And so I think Shark Spam, especially considering the price of this unit, is dead. I don't think it's not worth taking a Shark, but I said in my last point, you'd probably take 1 at most, because I could see needing that tech to reduce their charge, especially if the cav is like middling speed, like 10-inch cav. That's a decent one to be nerfing. 14, 16-inch cav, really rough. But I just don't see taking 2. Their output is super inefficient, which we'll look at now. So we've got its ranged attack. This is in dark blue. It's its base ranged, which is coming out to about 2.25 expected value average damage. If it's getting +1 rend against either cavalry or monsters, depending on which one you chose, then it's jumping up to a little, like maybe 2.25, but it's not that big of a difference. If you use all out attack, but not with the +1 rend, then it's just a little bit better than what I just said. And if you're getting both, it jumps up to about, 3.25 against, you know, all targets averaged out. It's just not really doing a whole lot of work. You're mainly just trying to hope you get at least 1 damage through to guarantee that you are getting to use that debuff. And then looking at its damage per 100 points against a couple other things, it's doing per 100 points 1 and 1.4 basically. The Leviathan's actually worse per 100 points, but you're not taking the Leviathan for its shooting attacks, as I mentioned last time. It's got good shooting attacks, but it costs a lot. It's got a high price tag that you're paying for largely the moving bubble of 5-up ward and for its combat attacks. But anyway, it is technically better, more efficient at shooting than the Leviathan. And then the Reavers, it's just no question. The Reavers are considerably better at roughly more than 3 times better. Because 100% worse is 2 times worse or whatever. And then, for each 100 thereafter, it gets more. So anyway, yeah, I'm not really thinking you're taking them for the shooting, except for the shooting tech to reduce charges if you can line that up correctly. And then for its melee, blue is in base. Orange is when the target, or there is something within 6 inches this damage. It doesn't have to be the target itself, just blood in the water, basically. And then max buffs was with, like, Volturnos and Storm, I believe, and Beastmasters, or all at attack, you know, instead of those first 2, or whatever, Volturnos and Beastmasters. So anyway, its output per 100 points in melee is 187, and then Volturnos is doing almost twice as much. The Ishlaen Guard is almost identical to Volturnos. Again, that's on the charge for both of those. And Volturnos is on the charge, Ishlaen Guard is against infantry, and then Morrsarr is on the charge, which is doing quite a bit better. So even if Morrsarr doesn't charge, it's more efficient than the Shark, which is just kind of sad. But anyway, I gave it 2 stars, like I said, because I think it has some utility as a shooting attack, but I think it needs to get a good bit cheaper. I would put probably Sharks at closer to 150. If you could reinforce them, I would maybe be okay with 190, because then you could maybe get some more value out of stacking them. If their shooting attack, the -1 charge die went off on a 2-up instead, I would think 190 is fair, probably. I don't know. I feel like there's something not quite clicking here. And if you've got a large Shark collection, I think I've got 5 or 6. I feel for you. But we all knew that that's how that works. They were too good for what they were. And then, it's not their time to shine. But maybe I'm wrong. And there's a version of this that really kicks ass. But let me know in the comments below if you've got a much stronger opinion about this. But again, it's early days, so these are just my thoughts. Okay, moving on to the two Eels. The second to last cheapest unit, yeah, I guess, that's second, second cheapest unit, I should say, or second to last most expensive unit is 3 Ishlaen Guard Eels for 180 points. They can be taken by the same choices as the sharks I was just mentioning. If we look at their war scroll, like Morrsarr Guard, they move 14 inches, so they're pretty fast. They didn't get nerfed since 3rd edition with regards to their speed, and their health didn't change. They still have a 4-up save and control 1. They still have a champ, a musician, and a standard bearer. And I can tell you right now that standard bearer does amazing work for a unit like this that has so few units or models it's working with. So if you have 3, you're counting as 4 on objectives, and that's fantastic for stealing some things from some other units you go into. That one extra thing goes a long way. So this unit used to be ethereal if it charged. Oh no, just at all times. It had an unrendable save, so it basically functionally had like a 4-up ward and then no save in front of that if you want to look at it like that. Of course, that doesn't ward against mortal damage, but you're ignoring at all times half of the stuff that comes through with normal saves, right? And then on the charge, save characteristic became a 3-up, which was also unrendable. I would much prefer that to what we now have, which is a rendable 4-up save and a 5-up ward on the charge. That's the green passive ability right there. Don't get me wrong, a 5-up ward is great. Even if they didn't want to give it unrendable, I would rather them. I think they should have put it on a 3-up save if you're going to say 5-up ward only if you charged, or maybe say it's a 6-up ward base and goes to 5-up if you get a charge off or something. I just don't think they're as tanky as everyone thinks they are. But their other ability, the red ability, any combat phase. Pick an enemy unit in combat. It could be any enemy unit. Roll a die. On a 3-up, again, that dreaded 3-up, subtract 1 from the attack characteristic of that unit's weapons for the rest of the turn. So it's combat attacks. This is a very strong ability, and this is what makes them actually tanky, in my opinion. Problem is, it's on a 3-up. And you could have multiple MSUs of Ishlaen Guard that are trying to trigger this because it doesn't count as not being able to stack until it actually gets applied to that unit. So they can be targeted by it multiple times. They just can't be affected by it multiple times because it becomes, what was it called, a delayed effect or whatever that counts then as a passive ability, and then they can't be affected by more than one passive ability or something like that. But anyway, you could try multiple times. And of course, let's say they were fighting something like Morrsarr Guard in a mirror match. If by reducing the attacks characteristic, and keep in mind, it's reducing mount attacks as well, which is really nice. So you'd be reducing the rider by 50%, and you'd be reducing the eels by 33%, which is quite impactful. And of course, if you got a charge off, which the red ability, the biovoltaic barrier, does not require that the unit has charged, but it does require rolling a 3-up. If it went off automatically or on a 2-up if you charged, I'd be even more enthused about it. Of course, I think it would be easier to convince me that this unit's really good. The other thing that the unit's got going for it is its attack profile for the rider is identical to that of Morrsarr Guard with two important distinctions. If it lost, or in contrast to Morrsarr Guard, it doesn't go up double in damage if it charged, but of course it does get a ward, so that's what its role is. But it does have +1 attack, which means it's functionally somewhere actually about halfway in between what the Morrsarr Guard would be on the charge and what they are when they don't get a charge. Which means, generally speaking, if you're not on the charge, this unit is the better of the two. If you get stuck in a prolonged combat, it's the better unit. But problem is that ward is only on it if it charged this turn. That's what's so frustrating to me about it. And with a 4-up save, this unit's going to melt pretty quickly without that ward if it's not killing enough stuff. So it doesn't, to me, it feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be. In fact, I would rather the -1 from the attacks to only go off on the charge, and then have a 5-up ward at all times or something. Some moving the pieces around so that it felt like it really had a role, because right now it feels like it's not actually tanking anything if you charge, or if you don't, like, I mean, if you don't charge, I guess. So the unit clearly has a profile that says, I'm okay with not charging in terms of its output. But then in terms of its defense, it's part of it's relying on a die roll and part of it's relying on you having charged. And I just feel like it's mixed messaging. I don't know if anyone out there feels the same. I think there is some value in the Ishlaen Guard, but I'd like to see their points come down a little bit or move some of those dials around. So let's take a look at the notes. It's the defensive eel variant, which is obvious at this point. Its output is superior to Morrsarr when neither of the two units got a charge off. It receives buffs well, just like the Morrsarr Guard, because the rider is a more considerable part of the total proportionate output that the unit is doing. Especially, that's even more true of the Morrsarr Guard for what it's worth, but it's still better than what it was for the sharks or for the turtle. And that would apply to the Eidolon of the Storms buff or Volturnos' buff. It's still best on the charge, but it's less necessary. It's less required. And the -1 attack is great, but it's unreliable. Let's take a look at its output. So this is not versus infantry, because, why not? And actually the difference between the infantry, so this is looking at being a little more conservative. It was a small difference. The +1 rend is just for the rider. And again, the rider's putting out some amount of output, but if it was for both the rider and the eel, then maybe I would have done a comparison. But the difference isn't very big. And so blue is the base, which is expected value average is looking at a little bit over 6 for a unit of 3. With external buffs, so that would be with the Eidolon of the Storm, Akhelian, and then either Akhelian Beastmasters and Volturnos for +1s to hit or all-out attack. We're looking at jumping up to about 9 for the unit of 3, and then once per game, plus all those externals. So the once per game is, I should have said once per battle, is Volturnos' +1 attack ability for the riders, which is a 33% improvement for the riders' output, but not overall. That bumps them up to about 10. So not really that much of a boost, but he gets to choose 3 units. So if they're one of the units that's around, plus a Morrsarr and then something else, that could be meaningful. So they're doing 370, as we've already seen, per 100 points. And then an Allopex is about 49%. Well, this is about 49% better than an Allopex. It's only about 2% better than Volturnos, so roughly within a standard deviation, they're basically the same. And again, that's assuming the Volturnos charged. And then Morrsarr on the charge are at... This unit is 45% worse than Morrsarr on the charge. But Morrsarr on the defensive, this unit's actually better than. Okay, speaking of Morrsarr Guard, let's move on to those boys. So we've got 3 for 170. And the thing to keep in mind there is that those 10 extra points could make a difference for you with all kinds of things that are going on with regards to trying to squeeze in points. Plus, considering they're the tankier version of Eels, I think does make a difference. Now, the rest is basically the same. Like, the rider's profile is 2 attacks instead of 3, so 1 less attack, but they do double damage on the charge, and they have a flat anti-infantry +1 rend, just like the Ishlaen Guard did. And the mount is identical. The big difference here is that instead of having the ward when they charge, and instead of getting to -1 from attacks, a characteristic of 1 unit they're in combat with on a 3+, they have a charge phase ability that's basically impact this. You pick an enemy unit within 1 inch of it to be the target, roll a number of dice equal to the number of models in the Morrsarr Guard unit. So if you're at MSU, you're rolling 3 or 6 at most. And for each 4 or 5 that you roll, you do 1 mortal damage. For each 6, it procs and does D3. So it could spike or just stay at 1 if you roll poorly. But that means for every 4, 5, or 6, you're getting at least 1 mortal damage off, if not more. So I believe at that rate, it's 2/3 mortal damage on average per model. So, that's something. And then if the enemy model that you targeted, or any unit that you targeted, outnumbers your unit in terms of models in those units, then you get to add 1 to the roll. Meaning it does 1 mortal damage on a 3 or 4, and then on a 5 or 6 it does D3, which is really nice, which bumps up the expected value per model in your unit to 1 mortal damage. So if you had 6, you're doing 6 mortal damage on average. And of course it could spike. But I don't like to look at super spiky chances because I feel like that's wishful thinking. Okay, so in the notes, we've got that this is the offensive eel variant, of course. Its output is inferior to Ishlaen Guard when neither got a charge off, but it receives buffs well, and I would argue even better because when on the charge, the riders actually have quite a bit of output. If you're getting the +1 from Volturnos and you're getting +1 to hit and the +1 to wound from the Storm, then you're sitting on 2 attacks, 2s, 3s, -2 rend if you're against infantry, and then 2 damage, which can do quite a lot. And then, of course, the eels are also getting some benefits. But that said, it has to charge to be efficient, not only for the extra damage, but also for the impact hits, mortal damage. And then I would say this is kind of our default setting for side missions. And what do I mean? Like taking the flanks is a really good one because they're just as fast as Ishlaen Guard, but they because they're a slight bit less tanky than Ishlaen Guard, they really need to hit that charge, and they are okay with not being in the engaged in the battle in the first round or two. Then they can be over there, come all the way back, and keep in mind, round 2 you have run and charge, run and shoot, so they can make it all the way back if they need to, and still charge if they have to. And they're 10 points cheaper than the Ishlaen Guard, which is why I'm saying they're kind of the default setting, because they have a good amount of output as long as you can arrange it correctly, and they are just cheaper to have. It's the cheapest fast unit you've got for going and taking flanks. You could argue for some thralls or reavers, but they're going to have a harder time making it back to the center, especially the thralls, and especially without some kind of teleport. Okay, so looking at its output, we've already done this in another video, so I'll go through it quickly. We're looking at, in the dark blue, their base output, base versus infantry, their charge, and their charge versus infantry. And perhaps this is a good visualization of why I didn't include the difference between versus infantry or not for Ishlaen Guard, because you can see in the expected value averages, especially on the base profile, the first two, there's just not much of a difference. It explodes a little bit more when they're on the charge, because you really want all of the successful to hit and wound rolls to go through the rend stage, the save stage, so that you get those 2 damage off, which means for every one that goes through, it does twice as much work. Anyway, so the Morrsarr Guard per 100 points is our best performer, as we've seen multiple times thus far. The Allopex, this is 65% better than the Allopex per 100 points. It's 32% better than Volturnos when he's on the charge, and it's 31% better than Ishlaen when they are against infantry. Looking at this is what they look like with external buffs. Again, this is only a unit of 3. So if they're not on the charge, and this is with the same collection of buffs that I'd referenced earlier, which would be Akhelian Beastmasters plus Volturnos or all out attack, and then the Storm thrown along there. That would be what we're looking at for all 3 of these here. Not charging, we're looking at just a little over 7, maybe closer to 8. But that's not really the main event. You really need to charge this unit, and then they jump up to something over 12, maybe closer to 12.5, 13. And then if they're also getting Volturnos' once per game plus 1 attack, which is fantastic on this unit because they have 2 attacks base for the riders, which means they're getting a 50% performance boost. It looks like they're pushing them up to around 15 or so damage against all saves. Obviously, you could look at the extreme side of things at like a 6-up save, which of course we don't have that many of in the game, to be doing something around 20-ish wounds, but that's not the best way to be looking at it. Okay, this unit, by the way, I might have failed to say, but Ishlaen Guard I gave 3 stars because I feel like they do have value, but I wouldn't maybe build my whole strategy around them. Whereas if you're going to go Cavalry, I do think you're going to need some Morrsarr Guard, not only for having some independent units that can fly around and go take objectives or whatever, but also to really get some of those really well charged or timed charges off where you're really deleting units, and so that you can guarantee that you can kind of rinse and repeat with charging in the following round. Also keep in mind both of these units are great power through targets against largely cavalry or infantry, because at 4 wounds apiece instead of 3, which is kind of the new standard cavalry size, they are outnumbering them with respect to their health characteristic and can therefore power through, do some wounds on the way out, and then continue to move 14 inches to go maybe steal an objective, or say that you're in soul raid ambushers to go hug a terrain piece so that you could then set them back into the Either Sea, which is pretty cool. But yeah, Morrsarr Guard, I think, is a 4-star unit because it's a necessary hammer, and it feels like what it wants to do is very obvious, and everything's synergistic with itself. That said, I would be wary of taking groups of 3 because I think you're going to often get stuck in combat with them. I would lean towards groups of 6, even despite the fact that the impact hits are more likely to go off with the +1 modifier if you are outnumbered, and that's easier if you have a smaller unit. But I still think ultimately, don't get greedy with that rule. Just make sure you clear the unit, and 6 is the best way to do so. Okay, so it does it for today, guys. Thank you so much for paying attention to this one. The last video of the series will be our foot troops, basically, our infantry, which is basically going to be covering the 2 Namarti units and then all the Ishlaen guys. And I won't be doing damage outputs for units that don't really need to be talking about their damage output, like, say, a Soul Scryer, because it's just not worth comparing, going through all the math. I might throw something on screen at the end to compare all the Ishlaen heroes, but I'm not going to do it as detailed as we did here. So I think the video will go a little faster. We'll mainly be talking about their tech value and what their extra power pair value is for the rest of your units in the game, and how they honestly really make Idoneth tick at this point, especially the Ishlaen casters. But anyway, guys, let me know down below what you thought of this video, what some of your favorite units are, how you're feeling about Idoneth now, and yeah, we're going to be doing Tzeentch and Slaves sometime in the next few weeks for index review, so keep an eye out for those if you're holding your breath for some chaos stuff. All right, until next time, Ryan out.